Thank you so much for being with us today on the show. We haven't had an author on yet, so I'm really excited to have you on today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your book.
Sure. Well, my name is Paula Jones, and I usually publish under Paula L. Jones. And I typically write novels for a teen audience and for adults too, like romance and sci fi. But because of some health issues, I decided to write a children's book. And it's all about celiac disease. Here it is. And
My
it's
friend
called,
Jack has celiac.
yeah, this is it. So, yep, I just wanted to spread awareness about celiac disease because it's something that's, even though it's fairly common, a lot of people don't know too much about it.
Right. Yeah, and my audience is people in general with gut issues. I have a lot of people with IBS, or maybe they don't know what's wrong. So celiac disease is something that should be usually when you go to a doctor, if you're having gastrointestinal symptoms, before they would diagnose someone with IBS, it's one of the things they should check for. And so I would say to my audience, if you think you have IBS, but you haven't been to a doctor, you do want to be screened for things like celiac disease. It can be screened for with a simple blood test that even your primary doctor can run even without having to see a gastroenterologist. And then usually it's confirmed by a gastroenterologist with a biopsy. Is that what happened with you as well?
Pretty much, endocrinologist is the one who ordered the blood test.
Mm.
And he noticed my symptoms, and right away he was like, I'm pretty sure you have celiac, but we're going to
Mhm.
order a blood test. And the blood test, you know how it doesn't usually just confirm it 100%,
Yeah.
but it gives them a good direction to go in. And he was like, based on your symptoms and the blood tests, you probably have celiac. And then years later, I went to a gastro and she performed a biopsy. But by then, honestly, by then I had not been eating any gluten for like, I don't know, maybe like 7 years.
Hmm.
So that messed up the biopsy because,
Yeah.
and I've heard this happens to other patients with celiac. Sometimes the gastro, if you've had it for a while, if you've had celiac for a while and you don't eat gluten, they will forget to tell you that you're actually supposed to eat a little bit of gluten before the test.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was inconclusive because it's like she didn't have any gluten in her body,
Right.
but you
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. And I actually see that all the time. What you just said is people don't know that and they're not told that. And so actually the goal of being gluten-free if you have celiac disease is so that your gut lining goes back to normal. So it should look like you don't have celiac disease when you've been gluten-free long enough. And that's so that, but then you get a false negative. So you do want to know if you have celiac disease, ideally, because you want to know that how strict you have to be with gluten. There's a lot of people out there with maybe wheat intolerance or some sort of other wheat or gluten issue that's not actually celiac, and they don't have to be as strict. And actually, in order to be so Monash University, which is a university in Australia that does a lot of work with GI issues, they say to be tested for celiac disease, you have to have 3 to 6 grams of gluten daily for at least 6 weeks. So that amount is 2 to 4 slices of bread a day or a half cup to 1 cup of cooked pasta. And maybe you can agree with this, but most people who've gone gluten free and are feeling better, that's just out of the question, right? For you to
right?
so it is something that if somebody suspects it and they haven't been tested yet, I tell them, well, go get the test real quick, the blood test at least, before you go gluten-free. Because also not only does the gut lining go back to normal, but the antibodies come down, which again, that's what we want. But you do ideally want to know if you have it or not. So tell us more about your book and what inspired you to write a children's book.
Absolutely. So basically, the premise of the book is there are two best friends. There is Chris, and then there's Jack. And Chris is just kind of explaining or introducing his best friend to the readers and say, hey, this is my best friend, Jack, and he can do all these great things. He's good at sports. He's really smart in school. But when it comes to snacks, like at snack time, we can't eat the same foods. And so he explains that when Jack eats certain foods, he gets a really bad tummy ache. And he explains this very simply using just language that's easy to understand and that isn't scary. Because most kids, whether they have celiac or not, have had a tummy ache. So they can relate to that. And then he explains what Jack can eat. So he keeps it very positive. Like he says, sometimes we'll have gluten free cookies, crackers, and fruit, and all, because there's all kinds of things that you can eat that don't have gluten and are safe for people with celiac. So the book, it's very lighthearted, and that's on purpose because celiac, it can be a little bit daunting. And especially when you're a kid, like if you are having a birthday party or going to a friend's birthday party and you're a little kid, there's going to be a lot of different foods there that it seems like everyone else can eat. And they look so good. And you're just a kid. I know it's hard as an adult, but when you're a kid and you see all those cakes and cookies, that's a lot of responsibility to have like the self control
Mhm.
to not eat that. So this book makes it a little bit easier by saying there are things you can eat. There's a whole lot you can do and eat. And you don't have to feel like weird or anything just because your body's a little different from other kids at school or in a neighborhood.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so you went through a lot of these same feelings as an adult, and as you say, it's even harder as a kid, right? Do you want to tell a
Yeah.
little bit about your story briefly?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So, yeah, like you said, I was diagnosed as an adult, not as a child. Okay, I'm kind of weird. Unlike most people, I love change. I don't like for things to stay the same. And this carries over even into the chronic illnesses that I have. I know this is such a weird way to even begin telling the story, but just go with it. Let me back up a little bit. Before I went to the doctor and was diagnosed, I was having really strange symptoms. Like, for one, my hands would start to peel, like the skin on the palms of my hands would peel. And I thought, well, maybe my hands are just really dry. I don't know. No matter whether it's winter, because, sometimes people get really dry skin in winter. But even during the summer in Louisiana, which is where I live, my hands would peel like they were dry and I didn't understand why. And then I would start like itching and that would freak me out a little bit. Like, what is that? But then the stomach issues came. It was like one symptom after another, after another. And I would be up all night, like literally all night in the bathroom. And that's hard to live with when you have several jobs, a full time job, plus two other jobs, like most of us do these days. So life was just really hard. I felt like I was always sick. And also, even though I eat a lot, I'm a big eater, but it's like I would get bloated and then lose a bunch of weight, get bloated, lose a bunch of weight. So my body was doing weird things. So when I mentioned this to friends and family, I'd be like, I don't know what is going on with me. I feel really sick. And I started being like, it was really affecting my everyday life. I was late for work because I couldn't get any sleep at night because I was in the bathroom throwing up all night. I would be late for appointments. I'd skip out on a lot of social interactions because I just felt so sick all the time. I wasn't me anymore. And when I mentioned this to some family members, they were like, well, maybe it's just in your head. Like maybe you have a lot of anxiety. And I was like, I took that seriously. I was kind of like, oh, maybe it is in my head. I don't know. So finally, I went to my general practitioner, and he didn't really know, but he did know that my thyroid levels were off, which is something that usually accompanies celiac disease. I've heard from a lot of other patients who have this. So I just thought, okay, well, maybe all this weirdness is associated with my thyroid. So eventually, I can't remember how long afterwards, this doctor's appointment, my thyroid kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I had a thyroid storm. And when that happened, I passed out. My heart started doing some weird things, like it got into a dangerous place. And while I was in the hospital, it was just terrible. So I had to be in the hospital for a few days. And then after I got out of the hospital, I was like, okay, so I think this is a thyroid disorder. At least I know what that is. What's going on? That's great. So I was happy because, like I said, I'm a weird person who likes change. So I'm like, okay, this is like a good thing. I know where to go from here. I can change the way I eat. But then after the thyroid storm, my GP was like, we really need to set you up with an endo. So I went to an endocrinologist, and I personally think this man is the best endocrinologist in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because as soon as he heard my symptoms, including the thyroid storm, he was like, have you ever heard of celiac disease? And I was like, no. And he said, I think you might have that because he said, I'm pretty sure you have that, but we're going to do a blood test. And so we did the blood test, and he was like, yes. He explained it's not 100% conclusive, but based on your symptoms and the blood test, I'm pretty sure you should not ever eat gluten again. You probably have celiac. And so I was like, okay, great, another another big change. So I was very optimistic, like weirdly optimistic about it. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember going to the store and I was so excited to see the gluten-free section in Walmart. And I just started buying all these gluten-free snacks and foods. And I told my family, I know what it is now, I have celiac. So I had people say rose tinted glasses. I
Mm-hmm.
thought all I have to do is just stop eating gluten and I'll be healthy again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I ate all of those gluten free snacks and gained a lot of weight because just because something's gluten free does not mean it's healthy. I learned that the hard way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also my symptoms didn't go away right away because I was in my 30s. Wait, no, I was 28, I believe. 28. And that means I'd spent a good bit of my adult life eating gluten. So my stomach was totally messed up. So it took a long time for the gluten to get out of my body. So I still had a lot of symptoms. And that's when my optimism started to fade. And I started to get a little bit depressed, just feeling like, man, what is celiac? I thought it was just you don't eat gluten, but then I realized there's a lot more to it.
How long was that after your original diagnosis? Like, how long had you been gluten-free at that point?
When I started feeling like, man, this is taking a while,
Yeah,
I would say about 6 months. That's
yeah,
when it hit me, and I was just like, wow.
yeah. I think a lot of the things you just said are very relatable to people. I hear from a lot of people too. And I mean, I understand this personally as well with some of the things I've been through. Sometimes you are happy to get a diagnosis, right? Which sounds so backwards, but you just to know what's wrong with you is so much better than not knowing. And then also, yeah, so many gluten-free foods. It is challenging at first because things are marked gluten-free that are their standard form is a wheat product. So it's going to be starches and crackers and cookies and the types of things we shouldn't be eating that much of anyway are the ones they mark gluten-free, but most whole foods are gluten-free. And then another thing is that wheat flour, which is the same thing as regular white flour, which is in any sort of bread or grain product, is enriched with vitamins. But when they have the gluten-free versions of these, which is usually a blend of flours and starches that are put together to try to make something similar to what we're used to wheat being like, they don't add those vitamins back in. So not only can you end up with very high glycemic foods, which is where you can gain the weight, but you end up with not getting the nutrients, which is an issue because when you have celiac disease, you haven't been absorbing nutrients for a while. So to then be eating foods that are not nutrient rich is a big problem. So the solution is to really take the approach of eating a healthy, whole food, gluten-free diet. And then those cookies and crackers and things, like you were saying, there are so many options for those sorts of foods, but those should be sometimes foods for everybody, right? Whether you have celiac or not, and you base your diet off of whole foods. It can take a long time for those antibodies to calm down. So you mentioned it was 6 months and you started to feel discouraged because you were still having so many symptoms. Well, for one, it can take many, many, many months, even after you're gluten-free, for those antibodies to calm down and for the inflammation to calm down. So even though the gluten itself is out of your body, it takes a while. And the second part is with anything, and gluten with celiac, unfortunately, you have to be very precise. Even a small amount of gluten can flare them up again for a while. So with anything, any new thing that we start to do, there's a learning curve. So it's not realistic that you're going to be 100% from the get-go. So that also causes a delay as you're learning to navigate gluten. You're getting a little bit here and there, and it takes a while. So it's not unusual for it to take a long time, and that can be very discouraging because logic would tell you, right? You avoid gluten, you should start to feel better more quickly than months, right?
Right. Yeah.
So tell us about what it was like finding answers and resources for this.
Mm, that's a good question. And see, the story doesn't really stop there at the 6 month point either. It gets more complicated. And this is probably important for people with celiac to hear, especially if they're newly diagnosed. Because one thing I've learned that I didn't know early on is that there's usually like a trifecta when it comes to celiac. A lot of people with celiac have thyroid disorder, celiac, of course, and type 1 diabetes. I did not know that. I thought I was just kind of a weirdo with a weird body who happened to have a crazy thyroid and celiac. And even though I wasn't eating gluten anymore, my body still seemed to be reacting to everything I ate. So, what I eventually did is I cut out meat, I cut out rice because I was just confused. I was trying to figure things out. I cut out rice, I cut out all sugar, I cut out almost everything. So, I started eating just like, oh my goodness, what would I even eat? I think like lima beans, and which I love lima beans, they're great. But when you eat them like every day and just like a small portion of them, nah, it gets old after a while. Like lima beans, and I think I didn't even eat broccoli that much because it's like cruciferous, I believe. Yeah, just anything that tasted good, I didn't eat, but things that tasted not so great, like dark leafy vegetables, that I would eat tiny portions of like once a day, every day. And the reason I did this is because I was at my wit's end. Some of my symptoms had gone away, like the peeling of my skin, that stopped. And the really bad rashes that come from celiac, like the hives, that stopped. So I was really grateful for that. But I would still get these weird stomach pains. I wasn't throwing up all night, but I'd still get other digestion issues. And I was still sick all the time. So I went on YouTube, which you got to be careful about this. And I learned this the hard way, and looked up, what do I have to do to get rid of celiac disease? Now, my doctors had already told me it's incurable. The only thing you can do is just maintain a strict gluten-free diet. But because I still felt so bad, I was desperate. So I went on YouTube and looked up how to cure celiac disease and found a nutritionist, except she wasn't a really nice lady, but she didn't really have training. She was just super excited about food and a little bit innocent when I was innocent too. And so I followed her on YouTube and I saw that she looked great and she was healthy. So I asked her, I sent her a message and I was like, so you seriously feel like if I follow this strict, I think they call it like a keto diet or something, keto diet, that it can actually cure celiac and thyroid disorder. And she was like, yes. So I was like, I'm all in. And also I was like, I'm going to be vegan too. That was one of the worst mistakes I have ever made in my entire life. I I lost so much weight. I went down to like 90-ish pounds, almost 80 pounds. My friends thought that I was anorexic, and I kept having to explain to them, I promise you, I'm not anorexic or bulimic. I'm not trying to make myself throw up. I just want to feel better, and I'm trying to follow this lady's diet. And the weird thing is, when I followed the diet, I did feel better at first. At first, I felt a whole lot better. The inflammation went away. So I thought this is working. Like for the first maybe like month, I want to say, for a month there, I felt really good. It was like being on a high. And I hadn't felt that good in years. But I was also losing so much weight. And then by the second month, I started feeling really weak. And then by the third month, that is when it got dangerous. And I started hallucinating. Like one day, I swear, it just like all of a sudden I started hallucinating. I was like, what is going on? This can't be right. And I started seeing like halos everywhere. Like there were weird colors everywhere. And can you imagine how that feels to just one day wake up and you're seeing halos and just
Crazy.
feeling,
Yeah.
yeah, I felt crazy. So I talked to my mom about it. It's like, I don't know what's going on, but this is really strange. And I was with a friend, and when it got to the worst point where it was really, really bad, and ended up in the hospital. But at the hospital, I had a really bad experience because at that point, I couldn't really speak for myself. I mean, I could talk, but because of the symptoms, the severity of the symptoms, it was like I wasn't being taken seriously. I'm a pretty calm person, even when I'm scared, and I was very afraid. But I was explaining to them what my symptoms were. And instead of testing me, like physically, the hospital that I went to in Baton Rouge, they thought it was all psychiatric. My family wasn't there at the time. I was just with this friend. And I explained, well, I don't have a history of mental illness, so I really don't think this is mental illness, but I mean, I don't know what's going on. And they were like, oh, well, are you on drugs? Have you taken drugs? I have never taken drugs in my life, like never. So I was like, no, but they actually put me in a psych ward, which was really scary.
Wow.
That's one of the scariest things I have ever endured in my entire life. And they were giving me medications for a psychiatric problem, but it kept getting worse, the hallucinations, and I started having seizures while I was in the hospital. And they were trying to get me to eat food because I was so thin at that point, really, really thin. And the friend who I was with, she didn't handle it the best way. I think she was very anxious and didn't know what to do. So she told them, she was like, I don't know. She's been losing a lot of weight lately. I think she might be bulimic, which of course, like it's not, that was not the case, but I don't know. That's what she told the doctors. So the doctors listened to her, and they were trying to force me to eat gluten, food with gluten, like lots of bread. And every time I would say, well, I have celiac, can you call my doctors and check my chart? They did not. They for,
That
I
just
don't know.
baffles me so much.
It was just the weirdest and most horrific experience. But finally, my family, my mother and my father and my brother, came to the hospital and confirmed what I was saying. She does not have a history of mental illness. She does have celiac disease. So the hospital at least gave me food without gluten. But they still didn't know what was wrong. And at that point, by the time they released me, I was afraid of doctors. I was afraid of myself. I was like, well, I don't think I have a mental illness,
Mhm.
but They did put me in a psych ward. I was so confused for a whole year. And then, exactly a year later, it was during COVID, that happened again. I started seeing these weird halos of colors and started feeling like I was about to start hallucinating and having seizures or something. I knew something was wrong. And I was so weak. Even though I wasn't as thin as I had been at the time, the last time that happened, I was so weak I could hardly walk. I felt like I was about to pass out. So I called my mom immediately. I was like, I'm not calling that friend. I'm calling my
Yeah,
mother. So I
right.
called my mom. I was like, Mom, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I can't walk. I feel really strange. Can you just bring me to the hospital and not to that other hospital? And she brought me to, I can say the name of this hospital because they are fantastic. Lady of the Lake Hospital in Baton Rouge, fantastic doctors. As soon as we got there, I'm telling you, like within minutes, they're like, "Oh, honey, you have type 1 diabetes." And I was like, "What? Diabetes? Like, I hardly eat any sugar." And they're like, "No, no, no. Type 1 is different from type 2. Type 1, you're usually born with." And I was like, "What?" Like, just it's so shocked. And they said these are classic symptoms, the seizures, seeing halos, even the hallucinations. When you get to a point where your blood sugar drops so low, and that can happen. And when it gets too high, that can happen. And they were like, it's a good thing your mom brought you in. She brought you in just in time. And they were able to give me insulin because at that point, my sugar was too high. So they gave me a whole bunch of insulin to bring it down. And they kept me there for a long time to make sure that I didn't succumb to something called refeeding syndrome, which
Mm.
is that's really important if you have celiac and type 1 to know about, like, because if your sugar gets too high, that means your body will not tolerate any food and you'll just start throwing it up and eliminating it. But once your sugar comes down, doctors say that it's really important, even though you're hungry, you're probably starving, to slowly introduce food back into your body. Because if you eat too much, it'll overwhelm your organs
Mhm.
and it can be, I think, deadly. So you have to be very careful. And that's called refeeding syndrome. So, anyway, that was a very long story. But the point is, and I learned this from a doctor in that ER at Lady of the Lake. He said, this is not very uncommon for people with celiac. A lot of people with celiac have the trifecta, weird thyroid disorders that cause all kinds of symptoms, the celiac, and type 1 diabetes.
Yeah.
So,
And it's because it's all autoimmune. And it sounds like we don't know what you got first, right? But when you have one autoimmune issue, it can cause kind of a cascade of other ones joining in. So that's one of the reasons I want to insert this here because half of people with celiac disease actually don't have any symptoms. So you're a person who had the dermatitis symptom, which is common with celiac disease, and you had the gastrointestinal symptoms, but not everyone has symptoms, or even people with symptoms. A very common question is, can I have gluten some of the time? And whether or not you could deal with the symptoms or whether or not it triggers symptoms, you're still activating that autoimmune response, which leaves you at risk for other autoimmune issues. So the goal is 100% avoidance. Like I said, we can't expect perfection from ourselves all the time, but we don't want to look at it as everything in moderation because it's not that sort of thing, unfortunately. And yeah, so type 1 is an autoimmune issue, type 1 diabetes, unlike type 2 diabetes. And that's why you were losing weight versus in general, people with type 2 tend to be more overweight. And you're born, I believe, with the gene, and then it has to be activated. Yeah, so you're born with the gene, and then it has to be activated. So it
hmm,
sounds like that's what happened. Maybe once you had celiac disease, maybe that was activated, triggered.
I'm curious, do you think stress can activate the
Yeah,
gene? Like high, oh, that makes a
yeah.
lot of sense.
Yeah, stress, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, our body interprets it in a similar way.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Okay. That hits the nail on the head. I tell you, you have to be like a detective sometimes when it comes to medical issues. You have
Yeah,
to turn into Sherlock Holmes and just look at every little aspect of your life and try and figure out
it's
what
so
is causing
true.
what.
It's so true. And the hard thing is, and that's one of the reasons for this podcast and these discussions, is no one's going to do it for you. It's key to find good help, but you always have to advocate for yourself and keep looking for solutions because, like, look what happened with you. You can't just take one person's answer as your end all be all, and that's just dangerous. There are nutritionists, I'm making quotes with my hands, out there that have no medical background. Maybe they took a 6 month certification, learned all this stuff, but they don't understand the physiology of these medical conditions. And it's just irresponsible to go out there and say you can cure a disease that there's no actual known cure for at the moment. So that's terrible that that happened to you. But it's hard when you don't know that. So I would say be cautious of people who don't have an actual medical, or I should say healthcare credentials. So either a doctor, a PA, a nurse practitioner, or a registered dietitian. But it's not to say other people don't have any value to their work, but I would just tread lightly out there. So what would you say are some common misconceptions with celiac disease that you're hoping to help with?
Yes, that's a good question too. I think that when someone is not familiar with celiac disease, they can easily think, oh, it's no big deal. You just don't eat gluten. Because that's what I thought at first. I was like, oh, this is great. I get a cool new diet, no gluten. No, it's so much more than that. It is a whole lifestyle change because, well, first of all, like you mentioned, you have to be very careful about not even ingesting even just a little bit of gluten. It can't be like, oh, there's croutons on this salad. I'll just go with it. It's okay. The salad will make up for it. No, it won't actually.
Mhm.
Those croutons will still hurt your stomach, your intestinal lining. So you have to be very, very, very strict when it comes to not eating gluten. Also, I feel like there is what's the word? Another aspect of celiac that goes beyond the physical. Like there's an emotional side to it, the way it affects your emotions, the way you perceive yourself. With any chronic illness, when you are physically out of commission for long periods of time, it affects the way you view yourself. I know that one thing that's happened to me over the years is it makes me feel less human. Like I love to work. I'm a workaholic. I probably get too much joy out of just working, 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 but I literally can't do that anymore. And it started with the celiac. Though I remember those nights when I would be just up all night, sick, 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 and then having to go to work the next day, to my many jobs the next day, and not being able to function like I wanted to or like I used to. And I felt like a loser, to put it simply. And now that my body has been through so much with the type 1 and the celiac and the thyroid disorder, I can't really work right now. I've always had 3 or more jobs. Now I write. That's pretty much what I do. I write. And that's a big difference. And like I said, it can make you feel like you're not living up to your potential because you're constantly having to keep an eye on your health, and your health becomes like your full-time job. So it can make you feel bad about yourself. So celiac, it doesn't just come with the physical aspect, but there's also the I don't know, but emotional side that comes with it, where you have to learn to give yourself some grace and be gentle with yourself.
I think that's incredibly relatable for anyone who's had a chronic illness because you do internalize those feelings because when you don't feel good when you feel awful, you don't want to work, even if you're a workaholic, right? Because you feel so awful. You're sick, right? But you do kind of feel like lazy, even when that's not who you really are. So it does separate you from yourself, your true self, right?
Right, yeah. And it can be hard for others to understand too. Like I mentioned a couple of times in our conversation, how friends would misinterpret my actions. They would see me not eating certain foods. And this started way like when I was first diagnosed with the celiac. Even though I would say, well, I can't eat that because I have celiac, they assumed it
Mhm.
was because I wanted to lose weight or be thinner. That wasn't the case though. It was because of my health needs. And then that got even worse as the symptoms went on.
So relatable with others with gut issues too, is a lot of times, in fact, I have a guide for people with IBS. It's a weight gain shake for IBS because you can't eat very easily because food is triggering you and you're losing weight. And I hear this from a lot of people. My friends think that they make comments, right? In your case, people thought you had an eating disorder, and I have clients who experience that, or they just comment, oh, skinny, oh, you can eat that. And we live in a society where it's not okay to call somebody fat or to make fun of them for eating if they're overweight, but people feel free to comment if you're underweight. And that's not okay either. That's just as bad because people who are underweight struggle, even if they had an eating disorder. But with gut issues, it's more than that. And what you described you went through, you develop a fear of food. You were eating lima beans and kale. That's it's I
Yeah.
mean, it's not an eating disorder in the way we think of it, but it's a fear of food because food's
Hmm.
gonna hurt you physically. And it's the very sad thing. And so it's great that you were able to identify the main root of the problem, the gluten, but then also figure out you had diabetes, food is affecting you in a whole bunch of different ways. So it was very complex in your case. And once you figure out what foods are bothering you, then you can get back to really focus on the foods that you can eat that are nourishing and healthy for your body. Usually there are foods in there that you like. You just have to be strategic, creative, and you get back to new go-tos because your life will change. Some of your old go-tos you can't go to anymore, but you develop new habits, new go-tos that then you'll get used to. So, what would you say? What do you hope listeners take away from this conversation? And especially as it relates to your book?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, twofold. First of all, I hope that if you're listening to this and you think you might have celiac, why not go get tested? Talk to your doctor about it. If you have these strange symptoms, you just feel weird after you eat gluten or you get sick, go get tested and just see what it is. And because knowledge is power, like they say, once you know what your body needs, you can give it what it needs. And it can be the beginning of a new chapter in life where you start to feel better. And with the book, I think it can really help kids who have celiac because celiac is not just something that adults have. Like, yes, I was diagnosed as an adult, but it has made me think like, wow, how would a little kid handle this? Because this can be a lot. So like the book, towards the back, it has a Q&A section where parents can sit with their kids and answer simple questions about what celiac is. And there are also a few recipes too in the back too, like for cookies and baked sweet potato and things that are gluten free. So that makes it a little fun where you get to go in the kitchen and experiment and eat good food. So even though you have celiac, you can
Mhm.
still eat great food and you can still enjoy life and be
Yeah.
healthy.
Yeah. And that's wonderful. I think this is just such a great story. It's terrible. you know, what you went through, but the fact that you went through all of those things that were so very difficult and scary, and you were able to figure it out and get to the point where you can enjoy food and not feel so scared and feel more at peace with everything. And it's always a journey, right? We're always having to manage it. But like you said, knowledge is power, and continue advocating for yourself and continue to stay positive and know that you're not alone, right?
Right, definitely for sure. Speaking of that, I would definitely recommend looking on Facebook groups for people with celiac disease. I'm in one that's for people with celiac and type 1 diabetes, which has been such a huge help. It's so important to have community because you can ask each other questions like, hey, I have this weird symptom. Has anybody else ever had that? And you'll get so many responses that are like, yes, I have had that. And this is what I did. And they're usually good about saying, now ask your doctor before
Hmm.
you do what I did, which I
Right.
love
Good.
that because
Good.
they've been through the mill. So they know to say, ask your doctor.
Okay, good.
But
Because I would say not every community where they say that. So I totally agree with you. I think community is invaluable. But just with that little cap, make sure that you check with your doctor on these things, because what works for one person is not what's going to work for the next. But they can certainly just, first of all, give you hope and give you that sense of I'm not alone, but also information you might not have thought to ask or thought of, right? Creative
right.
solutions that you're not going to get from the doctor. The doctor has 5 minutes with you. You need more than that. So I totally agree. That's a great tip. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And how can people find your book?
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, my book, My Friend Jack Has Celiac, is available on Amazon. You can also go to my website if you want to learn a little bit more and see my other books. That is author, AUTHOR, PaulaLJones.com.
Great. And we'll put that in the show notes. And I just so appreciate you joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Alyssa. I really enjoyed speaking with you. And I learned a lot from you today.